forgetting that it is not entirely just about the scientific research that goes in and tells us about this thing and what impacts it has, regardless of what the thing is. It's up to the court to figure out, as it relates to the Constitution, does this thing fall under the purview of the states with the Constitution, or does it fall under the purview of the federal government? So, unless you've been living under a rock in the United States, you probably heard the news at this point that the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson, I believe is what it is. But it's the Dobbs case for short. And back when the ruling was leaked, or the draft ruling was leaked, there was a number of pieces that came out from Science and Nature and Scientific American that that basically argued that science should be the only thing by which the justices make their decision, and that they shouldn't necessarily just consider what have you. It was very, very thick and obvious that there was a desire to have abortion. Again, this piece is not about my opinion on abortion or anything like that. This piece is actually a specific point I want to make regarding the limits and the role of something. And it's going to be a little bit different because I did do a video on this topic a little bit already, but it is going to be different because I was thinking a little bit more about it and doing some reading on a few other topics, and the idea struck me related to this topic and related to another topic together. They have the same threat, if you will. So again, this is not about my opinion on abortion. This is more so about what the limit of science is. In this particular case, the role of science in this versus the role of science in other things versus the role of the Supreme Court, or a legal perspective, because it's certainly not the same thing, right? So after the decision was made last week, and the rule and the ruling was released from the Supreme Court, Scientific Magazine came out with this tweet, and it links to the old article that actually was about, the draft opinion. So the draft opinion ended up being so close to the actual majority opinion of the court that Science Magazine saw fit to go back to this particular tweet and go back to that particular article. But there is two different things here, and I kind of harped on it because if you've seen this tweet before and you follow me on Twitter, you know I made a comment remarking this tweet because I called it very much a non sequitur and an ad hominem, because they're putting in an ad hominem and saying the justices are disregarding evidence. You don't know that they disregarded it because, as I was reading and understanding about it with respect to the recent decision, there was 130 amicus briefs that were filed, both for and against, if you will. And so it's not to say that they didn't consider the evidence. I'm fairly sure they did. But what's the role of science in this versus the role of the Supreme Court? There's two pieces that come to mind. So this tweet links to this science article, and I'm not going to read it over again because if you saw the other video on the role of science in controversial issues, this is in that video, so I don't want to rehash it over again. But just to make a point, because what they're talking about here is a collection of evidence scientists have found related to abortion and to economic outcomes related to abortion, for instance. Now, for one thing, with the economic part of it, with the economic part of it, the interesting thing about that is the only, well, decisions are more than just economic for a lot of people, we'll put it that way. But the other one that came out that is not about abortion is from Politico, midway through June, how the SCOTUS's upcoming climate ruling could defang Washington. A legal fight over the EPA's power to restrict greenhouse gases offers conservative justices an opportunity to tie the executive branch hands on a host of issues, from COVID to net neutrality. So, there's a point that's to be made here, is that a lot of these things involve scientific research and topics. Here, there's a lot of major things that do, whether it be climate change or COVID-19 or net neutrality, or because net neutrality comes at it from the tech side more than anything, or abortion, medical related things. Of course, science is involved there, but I'm struggling for a good way to say this. The role of science does provide, the role of scientific research, I should say, not the role of science. The role of scientific research in these things does provide evidence and data and what have you for the justices to consider as part of an argument. But what is the role of the court? The role of the court here is not the same thing, and other political commentators and what have you can say this even better than I can, but the role of the Supreme Court is the interpretation of the law as with respect to the Constitution of the United States, and whether or not, in the case of federal government related things, it falls under the power and the authority of the federal government. And that's what the Supreme Court has to do. It is not the job of the court to make up law out of whole cloth, if you will. It can't do that. It is supposed to interpret existing laws against the Constitution and see, whether they are constitutionally protected or not. Same goes for executive orders. Or I not say constitutionally protected, but kosher under the Constitution. And that's not necessarily what people think, because it is the job of the legislature, the Congress, to make laws at the federal level. And those laws also have to be in line with the Constitution, so if it infringes on the powers of the states or the rights of the people, for instance. Same goes for the EPA. The SCOTUS and the courts have to weigh in on whether or not the actions of a federal agency, for instance, and well, let's go down a little bit. Supreme Court is expected to issue a ruling this month. I don't think they've issued this one yet, but I gotta check. Hobbling the Biden administration's efforts to rein in greenhouse gases, but its impact could weaken Washington's power to oversee wide swaths of American life well beyond climate change. The upcoming decision on the Environmental Protection Agency's climate oversight offers conservative justices an opportunity to undermine federal regulations on a host of issues, from drug pricing and financial regulations to net neutrality. Critics of the EPA have clamored for the High Court to do just that by declaring it unlawful for federal agencies to make major decisions without clear authorization from Congress. The Supreme Court and several Republican-appointed judges have invoked the same principle repeatedly during the past year to strike down a series of Biden administration responses to the coronavirus pandemic. Liberal legal scholars worry the EPA case could yield an aggressive version of that thinking, unraveling much of the regulatory state that has existed since the New Deal. New Deal being under Roosevelt, if I remember correctly. One thing to note first here that I want to make a point on. If you notice the framing, undermine federal regulations, undermine federal power. A conservative would look at that and just be more right of center person would look at that as along the lines of no, that's making sure the federal government doesn't overstep its bounds and take away rights from the people or infringe upon the rights of the people. That's something the court is supposed to do. So there's a difference of framing there that I would point out. But what also is met here by major decision that's something that's entirely vague, so I don't know what that. But let's see. But these things here, whether it be climate change or what have you, yeah, a narrow reading of what federal agencies can do is going to literally handcuff the federal government from taking actions to protect Americans' health, safety, and the environment. So this is a thing here that we're talking about with this, is that immediate stakes in the EPA case are big enough on their own. Two coal companies in a phalanx of Republican-led states want the court to limit the agency's ability to regulate greenhouse gases from power plants, a major driver of global warming that threatens to worsen flooding, droughts, disease, and other calamities in the coming decades. The case's origins are messy and complicated. Okay. There's a lot of things that go into that in terms of, science of climate change. Pouring too many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere does have a negative effect in resulting in a warming atmosphere. That's not the issue. I'm not worried about whether you agree with me on that. The other thing from science here is the idea that, science tells us all these things. Science tells us all these great things. And if you saw me commenting on Twitter, you know where I'm going. Science tells us all these great things and what have you. Science can tell us a lot of things, or more precisely, more correctly, in my view, scientific research can provide us a lot of information on a lot of things. And they can tell us that doing something, or some practice will have an impact. Whether it be abortion, climate change, COVID-19, any number of different things. Scientific research can tell you that. No amount of scientific research can tell you whether or not that thing is a fundamental human right, is something that the Constitution protects, or rather, that the Constitution delegates as the role of the federal government, or delegates as the role of the Congress specifically, or the executive branch specifically, or leaves that to the states. That is precisely the role of something like the Supreme Court. And what got me aggravated when I saw this on Friday, and if you saw me, I was on the road over the weekend, so it's not like I could comment on it then. What struck me as aggravating with it is not recognizing that science can only say so much. Scientific research can only say so much, and it can provide evidence about, what is good, what is bad, and what have you. Well, not what is good and what is bad, but what kind of impact there will be. And that then can be part of what factors into the decision, and particularly, I think in the legal sense, and other lawyers may comment for me on this, in the legal sense, what is in the compelling interest of the state might be something that's brought up, and versus the rights that are involved, and whether or not rights are going to be infringed. Because, at least in my view, the primary purpose of the government is to make sure that people's rights are protected. And so the role of interpretation of the law is then extremely important. But scientific research can't do that. That is the limit of science. And it's not disregarding ample evidence here, because I'd take a bet that there was a lot that was presented in those amicus briefs that they had to pore through, and that their clerks had to pore through with them. And so I take a wager that they did see the ample evidence, and they didn't necessarily disregard it. But just saying that all they should take into account is this something and the impact that it has, whether it be positive or negative, is woefully misunderstanding the role of scientific research versus the role of the courts. in the United States, at least. Maybe different in other parts of the world, just saying. In this sense, the role of the courts is an interpretation of the Constitution, and whether or not case law is appropriate, whether or not it falls under the purview of the federal government or what have you. Whatever question, as it pertains to this thing going on right now and how it relates to the Constitution, is what the court has to deal with. The court doesn't make judgments on scientific research alone. It has to make judgments using legal reasoning as well. And that's what happened, really, with the case of Roe versus Wade last week and the like. So, such is, but to say the justices are just utterly ignoring certain things and the like here is forgetting that it is not entirely just about the not entirely just about the scientific research that goes in and tells us about this thing and what impacts it has, regardless of what the thing is. It's up to the court to figure out, as it relates to the Constitution, does this thing fall under the purview of the states with the Constitution, or does it fall under the purview of the federal government? And that's a tough and tricky thing to figure out, and a whole range of expertise that I definitely don't have. Whether you think it was rightly or wrongly decided, or any decision is rightly or wrongly decided for that matter, that's up to you to decide. Just as much as it is up to the Supreme Court, in this case, to decide whether or not something is the purview of the federal government under the Constitution, the purview of the courts under the Constitution. Never mind the fact the Constitution probably does say, as I was thinking about it, the interpretation is what the courts do. They cannot make law. A simple way that I learned it in school, if you will, the executive is supposed to enforce the law, the Congress is supposed to make the law, the courts are supposed to interpret the law. And that's where it becomes important with that. But that's really just what I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit more, because I was commenting it on Twitter and I thought it would be worthy of an elaboration. But the thing about it is that scientific research is all well and good, but there's a limit to what it can do. Whether it be about moral questions, which part of this is moral questions that we're dealing with, or about constitutionality and legal questions. There's only so much it can do. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, my friends.